Today, we have the wonderful opportunity to interview Senator Joseph Lieberman about his book, With Liberty and Justice, which was published by OU Press in conjunction with Coven. And the theme of the book is about the 49 days of the Omer, the counting, and the theme of linking the theme of freedom and redemption from Egypt, liberty, with ultimately with Matan Torah, with the giving of the 10 Commandments at Sinai on Shavuot, and therefore the link from liberty and justice. So, Senator, let me begin by asking you, what motivated you to write this book?
Thanks, Rabbi. Great to be with you. Well, one answer is that you motivated. It's a longer story than that. I guess it goes back in my my Jewish upbringing, my Jewish education. So, but the truth is that you did play a pivotal role after you motivated me to do my book on Shabbat, which OU Press and Simon & Schuster published, called The Gift of Rest. You had been talking to me about doing a book on Pesach, and I resisted because I felt there were so many books about Pesach, about the Haggadah, about the Seder, et cetera, et cetera. So I always had been drawn to Shavuot and been educated by my rabbis, who were obviously influenced by your Rav Soloveitchik, to see, and others earlier, to see Shavuot as the completion or extension of Pesach, connected by the counting of the Omer, but really connected philosophically in the more direct sense that the Pesach story is about Yetziat Mitzrayim. It's about the liberation, exodus from Egypt, from slavery. And of course, for us, it is the ultimate proof that God, Hashem, kept the Brit, the covenant made with Avraham Avinu, re-entered history, heard the cries of the Jewish people, Bnei Israel, in Egypt, and liberated through Moses, the Jewish people. But what always struck me in what I was taught, and I think it's so important both to the Jewish narrative of history and of the Jewish destiny and purpose, but also, as it turns out more broadly, to civilization, was the role that law played. In other words, that throughout the Chumash and the description of the discussion, the negotiation between Moses and Pharaoh, and in a broader sense between God and Pharaoh, it's clear that what Moses is asking is not just for freedom on behalf of God, but to be able to leave Egypt and slavery and to serve God. And how does one, in other words, as I say in this book, not to be liberated from slavery and stay in Egypt and live sort of according, assimilating into Egyptian society, free but not Jewish, not to be liberated to wander in the desert, but to go to Mount Sinai and to receive the 10 Commandments and the law, and then to complete over a number of years the journey to the Promised Land. In other words, Israel was given its values. It was liberated to serve God by accepting the law and the values of the 10 Commandments at Mount Sinai, and then on to Israel to try to build a society that was based on that law. So it's a very powerful idea, which affected me, I think, in my career choice to be a lawyer, to be a lawmaker, to be a law enforcer. And of course, it's had, because the story of Passover and the receiving of the law on Mount Sinai, the revelation, as some call it, redemption to revelation was so broadly accepted by Christianity and to a certain extent by Islam also, but specifically regarding Western civilization, the Christians carried this on, brought it to America, became part of our system of law. So, I mean, as you can see from my answer to your first question, I could go on quite a bit on this theme, but so you and I talked, and I said, I'd like to try to do something about the role of law and justice, liberty with justice, which is the Jewish destiny, and has become in some ways the purpose of the United States and of Western civilization.
I mean, you cite in the book, of course, when Moshe Rabbeinu gets his initial mission from God in Egypt, he says, what's the proof, as Moses asked, and God says, when I'll take you out of Egypt, Tavdin Elokim ala har hazeh, at Moshe, at the burning bush, that this you'll come and you'll come back to this mountain. In other words,
Yes.
This is the ultimate mission.
Yeah.
And there's the link between the two. So who is the audience that you're looking for in this book? How broad is that audience?
Yeah, of course, I'm looking for everybody, but the book,
Every paying customer, I understand.
Right. The book is organized according to the days of the counting of the Omer, from the second night of Pesach to Shavuot. So I have divided the book into 49, 50 sections. And I'm now looking at the book. As section 1 is...
Let's see it.
Okay, there you go. With
Good.
Liberty and Justice, the 50-day journey from Egypt to Sinai. Incidentally, I was very happy to have a collaborator on the book, Rabbi Ari Khan, who lives in Israel, has a Bet Knesset there, also is on the faculty of Bar Ilan, and is a published author himself. And there too, you are not only my muse, but in a broad sense, you were my shotgun, because you introduced me to Ari Khan. He helped me very much. So, I mean, I divide the book into these 50 chapters, and basically describing what I've just described to you as the purpose of the book, talking about the role of the law before Har Sinai, including that wonderful exchange that you referred to at the burning bush to return here, then to the 10 Commandments, because in many ways that's the centerpiece of this system of law, and then to various commentaries on the law after Sinai and some about Shavuot. So in the most direct sense, I hope that Jews who observe Passover and Shavuot and count the Omer may use this as a companion, because there is a separate reading for every one of the 49 days leading to the 50th. It can also be used, of course, and since we're recording this now during the Omer, just a couple of weeks from Shavuot, it can also be used, such as it is this year in the midst of the pandemic, I think is a hopefully a thought-provoking text, which is broadly accessible by people regardless of their level of background and learning, for a tikkun, for a Leil Shavuot, a study overnight if they're going to do it on Zoom this year. But of course, I hope that this will be read by others who are not either non-observant Jews or not Jews, who really hold the 10 Commandments and the revelation at Mount Sinai as central to their own faith or their own living experience. One of the things I talk about is the disproportionate number of Jewish people who are lawyers. And there are a lot of societal reasons for that, but I do think that one of the reasons for that, including my own decision to become a lawyer, is because of the centerpiece of the law in in Jewish religion and history. And one of the things that always strikes me is that obviously there are religions that have statues that are prayed to, and sometimes statues at festivals that I used to see in New Haven, Italian American festivals, particularly statues of saints would be marched around in a religious setting. But what do we Jews march around in our synagogues? It's the Torah, it's the Chumash, it's the 5 books of Moses, it's the law. I mean, there is a reason that we are called the people of the book. And the book is the 5 books of Moses, and crystallized by the 10 Commandments, which was received by Moses on behalf of the Jewish people and the people of the world on Mount Sinai, celebrated on Shavuot. So that's why I say at the beginning what I believe that Pesach is clearly the most observed of any Jewish holiday. I would guess that Shavuot may be the least observed, and but it's for various reasons. But its purpose is what we celebrate, what we commemorate, what we commit ourselves to on Shavuot is at the very heart of what it means to be Jewish, and more generally, what it means to be religious of any faith.
Well, from Pesach to Shavuos, from liberty to law, the Omer begins with the offering of the Korban HaOmer, which was barley, and barley generally was fodder for animals, not humans. The only korban that's made of barley is the Korban HaOmer, and one other, the Korban of a sota, a woman who was accused of adultery because she acted in an animalistic way. So the liberty by itself, not redeemed by law, is incomplete. And ultimately on Shavuos, we offer the shtei halechem, the 2 loaves of bread in the Beis HaMikdash, and they're made from wheat, and they're bread, not just grain, because that represents human intervention, human contrivance, technology, and it represents the ultimate. Law represents the, of course, it's God-given law, but as understood by man and developed by man, represents the ultimate redemption. So liberty by itself is insufficient, and I think that's one of the themes that you have in your book.
It is. That's a beautiful word, and connecting it with the Omer, which I appreciate, Rabbi. But that's part of the point I'm trying to make. We celebrate freedom. I mean, in a very real way. Part of what Pesach is so widely observed, particularly by Jews, but also by non-Jews, is because of the appeal of the idea of freedom, that by the intervention of God, the children of Israel were liberated from slavery in Egypt. We know, of course, in the history of America, how important that narrative from the Torah about the Yetziat Mitzrayim was to the American civil rights movement. So that's compelling. But the message of the Torah is very important, and I'm trying to make in this book, and of course you're more than familiar with, just what you say, that freedom is not enough. Freedom is our birthright, but freedom without law will lead to trouble, will lead to chaos, probably immoral behavior, violence, and perhaps even the self-destruction of society. The message that Hashem was giving us in the Torah by going from Egypt to Sinai to get the Torah and the 10 Commandments, I think is that only if you have law with liberty is there the possibility of having justice. And in fact, if you have liberty but no law, you will end up in a way. Well, you'll end up where the children of Israel were in the time of Noah, pre-Sinai, with really a disaster.
Senator Lieberman, you've served as an important model, not only for the Jewish people in the United States, but generally so well respected in terms of you've spoken about licentiousness on television and so on. And in your book, you mentioned some of these encounters. I remember you have in the book, you have a discussion once Senator Ribicoff, senator from Connecticut, who you knew well and worked for, he asked you to speak. I think the one of the deans of the Senate then, maybe it was Senator Russell, had asked him to speak about whether the God of the Old Testament was a God of vengeance. So can you sort of account that?
Yeah, that's a wonderful memory I'm lucky to have. So during college, I began to, for a lot of reasons, my own upbringing in Torah, Judaism, the whole notion of, Kiddush Hashem, Tikkun Olam, my own reading of history, American and world history, and then the coming to office of President Kennedy, which had a big effect on people of my generation, motivating us into public service. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. The themes in the Kennedy inaugural are very Jewish, in my opinion. He closes, I'm wandering a bit, but I'll come back. It closes with this magnificent sentence, which I'm paraphrasing, of course. In all that we do, we will ask God's blessings, but we know that here on earth, God's work must truly be our own. So it's a real, it's very similar to my religious upbringing. But so I began to think about going into public service and politics, and through a mutual friend, I was able to receive that is a woman I knew who's a mother, a classmate of mine at Stanford High School, knew Senator Ribicoff, and I was able to be an intern, summer intern in his office in 1963. He had been governor of Connecticut, first Jewish governor, 1954, quite a hero to me, really. He was an early supporter of Senator Kennedy, and
cabinet member.
Pardon?
Cabinet member.
Yes, and then Kennedy asked him to be the secretary of what was then called Health, Education, and Welfare. It's now called Health and Human Services. But and he didn't like that at all. He didn't enjoy that. I'm wandering a little bit. It's a good lesson. Years later, I had lunch with Senator Ribicoff, and he said those 2 years in the Kennedy cabinet were the worst of my public service. So I said, why, Senator? He was in the Senate then. Why, Senator? What happened? He said, well, I've been governor, and when you're governor, really, you determine what happens. He said, as a member of the cabinet of President Kennedy, with whom I had good relations, he said, I kept receiving these calls from these 25 or 30-year-old kids from Harvard telling me what to do. And so anyway, he came back and ran for the Senate.
Not even from Yale.
Not even from Yale. This is the chutzpah they had from Harvard. Yale would have been much more modest, of course. Anyway.
John Kennedy, when he got a Yale honorary degree, he said, now I have the best of two worlds, a Harvard education and a Yale degree.
That's right. I was actually there that day. It was a wonderful day. Anyway, I was an undergraduate then. So I worked in Ribicoff's office that summer, and it was fascinating because it was very small. It was so tiny compared to the Senate office when I got there. He had a chief of staff, a legislative director, a public relations person, and like maybe 4 or 5 caseworkers, maybe a couple of secretaries. But anyway, so I was doing odds and ends, really. And one day, they told me the senator wanted to see me in his office. Wow, this is big. So I went in, and he said, Joe, if I'm not mistaken, you're religious. I said, I am. So he said, well, I've just had a wonderful invitation from, and I think it was Senator Russell. They had a weekly prayer breakfast of 15 or 20 of the senators at that time, Jewish people didn't go, it was all Christian. And they had asked him to come and speak on the topic of, is the God of the Old Testament a vengeful God? Wow. And he said, I've been thinking about it, but I think perhaps you have some ideas about that. And I know you work on the El Daily newspaper. So why don't you do a draft for me? So I did some work. I think I spoke to my rabbi. There was a professor of Old Testament or biblical studies at Yale, prominent person named Judah Golden, now gone many years. So I called him and we talked about it. And I wrote it wasn't really a speech, it was a kind of Dvar Torah for Senator Ribbentrop to give at that breakfast. And the position I basically took was, no, the God of the Old Testament was not a God of vengeance. God was a God of law, of values, and a loving father, really, to the people, which is why they were chastised, and always really merciful, always approached people, even those who did wrong, mercifully. So Ribbentrop took it, and he came back from the breakfast that day, and they called me into the office again. Big deal, really. And he said, oh, the speech was such a success. And I believe that this will have a measurable effect on my ability to be an effective senator, because suddenly I've broken into this group of powerful senators, mostly Southern Democrats then, were all the committee chairmen, they'd been there forever. And so it was funny, but my background enabled me to play that role. And of course, it was probably during that summer that I began to form these dreams that, of course, I never would have revealed to anybody. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be a senator? In fact, when I left law school, if you'd asked me what my dream was, I said, what do I want to do? I said, well, I'm very lucky I have this position at a wonderful law firm in New Haven. Maybe I'll go into public service. That was what I would say. But really, I had a goal, which was to be a dream, to be a U.S. senator. And, Baruch Hashem, I lived the dream.
In the book, you mentioned that after you were appointed or the word leaked out that Al Gore was going to appoint you to be his running mate, you got a call from Jesse Jackson. How did that call go?
Well, that was really something because, I'd known Jesse Jackson some. Of course, I've been in the civil rights movement during my time in college and earlier, and I had a pretty good voting record on civil rights, but I wasn't quite ideologically what Jesse wanted me to be. And I was very active in a group called the Democratic Leadership Council, which President Clinton came out of. It was a new Democratic group, third way, more centrist Democratic Party. Jesse Jackson used to refer to the Democratic Leadership Council as DLC, standing for Democratic Leisure Class. So you can see anyway, he called me. I got a call from him that Monday morning after the story had been let out by the Gore campaign that I was going to be his selection for running mate. It was a wonderful conversation where he said he was very excited and he thought I would be a wonderful vice president and a great candidate. And he said, but I'm really also reacting as an African American, because I believe that in America, when a barrier is broken for one group, the doors of opportunity open wider for every American. So obviously the fact that you're the first Jewish American on a national ticket means to me, Jesse Jackson, that we African Americans have more to look forward to than we did before. Frankly, I had something of the same feeling in 1960 when John F. Kennedy, as a Roman Catholic, first time ever, got elected president. I wasn't really thinking of being, I wasn't yet formulating a political idea, but I had an idea that in some general sense that Kennedy's election was going to open doors for me. I'll tell you a beautiful story, and it's even more beautiful in the tribute to Barack Obama, because in 2000, a tribute because I was supporting my friend John McCain that year against him. I saw Barack Obama after he clinched the Democratic nomination for president. He came back to the Senate to vote, and I went over to him. I think I tell the story in this book. I went over to him on the floor and I congratulated him and said it was really a great accomplishment. He thanked me, and then he said, you know, one of the reasons I was able to do this is because of the way you ran for vice president as the first Jewish candidate for national office. And what could I say but thank you? He was very gracious.
Well, the other important civil rights leader that you met, and you speak about in the book, the most important civil was Dr. King.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can't say I was very like a close friend of Dr. King's, but I did have some meetings. So, I was that summer. I was in Washington, 1963, working for Senator Joe. In August was the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, led by Dr. Martin Luther King. There were over 200,000 people there. It was a significant moment in the American Civil Rights Movement, and in some sense led to the adoption of the Civil Rights Act, or at least created momentum for it. So I was there in Washington. I asked my boss in the Robocop office, can I go to the march? And I did. I'll tell you two things about that. One is, who do I run into at the march but my rabbi from Stamford, Connecticut, Rabbi Joe Lieberman, graduate of YU, student of Rav Soloveitchik's, really a classic, engaged, modern Orthodox rabbi. And there he is with a bi-racial, interracial, interfaith delegation from Stamford, Connecticut, marching for jobs and freedom behind Dr. King. But I was there at the Lincoln Memorial when Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech, really one of the great speeches in American history. It was very moving at the time. I don't know that I could have said it was would be one of the great speeches. Anyway, I came back to college. I wrote about it, and long story short, but the chaplain at Yale, who was a tumulator himself, William Sloane Coffin, at one point said there was a movement to send students from the north of Mississippi and to work in a mock election to prove that African Americans really wanted to vote there, but weren't being allowed by the authorities. I went down for about a week or 10 days with about 30 or 35 students from Yale, and then came back, and it was quite an experience. That's a story for another book. And then I found out about 2 or 3 weeks later, maybe a week or two later, that Dr. King was coming to speak in Bridgeport, Connecticut. And so I went down to Bridgeport from New Haven to hear him. He was late, and somebody told the people running it that I had just come back from Mississippi. They asked me if I'd go up and talk about what I saw. And while I was on speaking, Dr. King arrived, and as I left the stage, he came on, and he shook my hand and said in that magnificent voice, "Very good, young man." Those are 4 words I took with me. Very good, young man. I saw him a few times after that, Rabbi, in a very different setting. Happened that the real hero of my youth, not any politician, Jackie Robinson, moved to Stamford, Connecticut.
Really?
I had his kid in a summer camp that I was a counselor at, and he invited me, he and his wife, to these benefit concerts he did for civil rights, and it was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, on his magnificent house, lawn, big pond behind it. And twice Dr. King was there. So I got to talk to him briefly in a very relaxed and different setting. Anyway, but he was, I think that part of the reason why he was so successful in America in advancing the civil rights movement was, of course, his courage, and his eloquence. But his eloquence was used to speak from a Hebrew Bible context, also the New Testament, but he made it something. Then it was confrontational. He needed to confront the status quo of racism and segregation, or it wouldn't change. But he spoke in terms of the Judeo-Christian tradition, which was really absorbed by, probably more by, at that time, by Christians and Jews. And I think it was part of what helped to wake people up. This is wrong, segregation, and that made him so successful, to the point where President Kennedy began to act, but really President Johnson was the one, Southern Democrat, Southwestern Democrat, who made it happen.
We're speaking now, of course, in the midst of an enormous crisis, the corona pandemic. We haven't seen anything like this in a century. So none of us remember it, of course. But your family history was profoundly affected by the Spanish flu in 1918, 1919.
Yeah, little known. I mean, I guess you and I have talked about it. I know we have, but my father's mother, Rivka Segalovich, was an immigrant to the United States. I don't know exactly what year she came. I'm guessing, we guess it was around 1910, 1912. Interestingly, she came alone. She was one of about 8 or 9 brothers and sisters from Poland. And why did she, but within, it was then Belarus, so it was part of Russia. She was an activist in a Yiddish socialist party called the Bund.
The Bund.
Famous, yeah. Anti-Zionist in some ways, unbelievable. And her family believed that she was about to get arrested by the Tsar's forces that came to America. Anyway, my grandfather came also from Poland, a different part from Kielce, and went to Canada, then came from Toronto down here. And they met in New York and got married. My father and my aunt Hannah, both of blessed memory, were their children. But before my father reached the age of 3 in 1918, in the Spanish flu pandemic, his mother died from the flu. And it had a tremendous effect on his life. He was remarkably strong. I think in some way he was born with it or he reacted to it. But his father actually put him into an orphanage in Yonkers, New York. And as you probably know, and I didn't before this, there was a kind of network of Jewish orphanages built by the preceding generations of Jewish immigrants from Germany, Holland, etc., who had achieved some wealth. And it was to take care of the children of dislocated immigrant families. But here was now, because of the flu, my father was put into the orphanage. He was actually there for 7 years until his father remarried, moved to New Haven, Connecticut, and then took him out. And he spent his years from on in New Haven, got out of high school, and then worked his way to Stanford. But a tremendous loss. I used to, my father had no memories of his mother. I once met a cousin who lived in the Bronx who knew her because she had originally come to stay with his mother in the Bronx, who was also a cousin. And I said, what do you remember of her? And he said, not much, except she was high-spirited. And so I took those words. I assumed she had quite a personality. Maybe she was opinionated. After all, she was a member of the Bund. And it was a great loss for my father. And of course, I never knew her, so it was a great loss for me as well. And needless to say, during this pandemic, I've been thinking about that, her a lot. And of course, the pandemic of 1918 was awful. I mean, the estimated number, statistics were not as well kept then as now, but they estimate that at least 50 million people were killed worldwide in about a year. Some people say it was 100 million, but of course, every one of those is a story, and that's the story of Rivka Segalovich. Incidentally, every one of her siblings made Aliyah, beginning about 1910, 12, 14. And one of her brothers, Moshe Segalovich, my father's uncle, was early and fought with Trumpeldor to defend the first Jewish settlements of that period, and was killed. And I'll tell you, one time I went to Israel with one of the first times, late.
But he was killed the same time as Trumpeldor was killed?
No, but he was with Trumpeldor in his forces.
Uh-huh.
He wasn't. I don't think it was the same time that he was killed. But if you go, there's a military cemetery up north called Tel Chai in Israel, and in the front row, Moshe Segalovich. I was so proud. I had a cousin there who took me to see it because it's a source of pride, obviously, for the family in Israel. So anyway,
just to bring it back to the book, of course, the period of the Omer is a time of mourning, of Avelus. We don't take haircuts. You know, Lag BaOmer is a day of celebration within this mourning. And that commemorates an ancient plague in which the students of Rabbi Akiva, 24,000 of them, all died.
Yes.
Either was it Rabbi Soloveitchik thought when the Gemara speaks about a plague, maybe it was a metaphor that they died in the battle with Rome. But, you know, now's a time that people were all sort of ensconced in our houses. We can't go out or very limited. Now's the time to be inspired by your book, and they can pick it up and read it. And the juxtaposition of justice and liberty, understanding how you can't have one without the other. Now's the time to focus when we have time of meditation. What do you think, just in concluding remarks about, you know, in this time of this pandemic of the corona crisis?
Yeah, well, it's a real test of all of us, because you have to be smart, though, and we have this from our own halakha, the centrality of pekuach nefesh, protecting our health, if you can translate that broadly. It really has to be foremost, and it requires us to listen to the experts and to do what's not natural in the modern world, but we have to stay alive. So we're in our houses, but it is fascinating how many of the tefillot, including particularly Tehillim, have references to plagues because they were part of life. But going back, of course, to Mitzrayim, but in years after that as well. And I must say, on this, we're recording this a couple of days after Lag BaOmer. I was hoping that as we believe that the plague among Rabbi Akiva students ended on Lag BaOmer, that hopefully we're near the end. I'm afraid we're not right now, but soon, of this plague, and it you know, it reminds us to value what is most important. I was on a call the other day with some people discussing this, and somebody said, you know, think about my grandmother, that in some ways we're not much more advanced than they were in 1918. All they could do was stay inside. They had no medicine. In some ways, they didn't know enough to stay inside. That's what they tell me about my grandmother. She was out she was very strong, apparently, and healthy. So she was out helping people who were sick on the Lower East Side of New York, and she obviously got it herself and died. So, but we have this remarkable ability to, this is what, going back to Kennedy, here on earth, God's work is truly our own. And so it requires wise and strong leadership, and it requires the extraordinary innovation and entrepreneurship of people in the public and private and science, medicine, technology. And I'm an optimist. I think we're going to have what they call a therapeutic. It's really a treatment drug before too long. But then the key is to have a vaccine, and they're working very hard with a lot of money pouring in from private and public sectors. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have a vaccine. It's not going to be able to be distributed to everybody overnight, but it's been quite a test, and it brings us back to fundamentals. You know, what's most important. It's nice to make a good living, et cetera, but the most important thing is to be alive and to hope and pray that our families are well. And so far, Baruch Hashem, that is report I give you on my family, and I know it's true of yours as well. Thank God.
So, Senator, thank you very much for spending this time with us.
Thank
I
you,
recommend
Rabbi.
everybody to really, especially now that they have, that's for sure, they have time to read. And if you reach out to the OU press, we're
Yeah.
able to get the book to you with liberty and justice. And Senator Lieberman would agree with me, with liberty and justice for all. He hopes everybody buys the book.
Right.
So it's for all. And everybody, please stay safe and well. And we have to thank Senator Lieberman not only for this book, but for being the inspiring leader that he's been throughout his career, who's really been a model for our community and well beyond. Thank you, Senator.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thank you very much.